everyone, Gaijin Goombah here. Alright, Witch Ninja Zuko was done. Freaking finally. 34 minutes of analysis on that boy, and it's finally done. And we're right back to Ghost of Tsushima.
Wait, we did a freaking 27-minute Witch Ninja video on Jin, and you're telling me there's still more?
Well, yeah, we only covered the shinobi-ish aspects of Jin from Ghost. There's still the rest of the freaking game to talk about. But I'm with you on this one. After all these extensively long analysis videos, I think I'm due for a week's break. I mean, it is my birthday coming around the corner, so it'd be a nice gift to—
Oh, sweet, I've been dying for a vacation!
After this— Alright, you know what? It's fine. I actually wanted to go solo on this one anyway because the experience that I had with Ghost of Tsushima was very much a personal journey. Not only because of the emotional roller coaster that the various narratives drove me on, but probably more so the adventure that I went picking apart the time and places this game borrows from. It was more than just ninja tendencies that caught my eye with this game. Everything from designs, to characters, to locations, to even philosophies filled me with so much curiosity over the last month that I've been neck-deep researching the origins of all these aspects. And while I don't have the Library of Congress or the Kokuritsu Kokai Toshokan at my disposal, I think I found enough information for me to make an exceptionally bold declaration. In my humble opinion, Ghost of Tsushima is the most perfect Japanese game developed outside the country itself. There it is. I can hear it now. The insufferable outrage, the grinding of teeth of the righteous indignation, the internal screaming of individuals wishing they could shove every last one of Ghost of Tsushima's inaccuracies through the screen and right into my face. Well, grab some tea or cocoa and relax. There's no need to get so wound up. Because there's two things I realized when exploring this game. For one, Sucker Punch straight up said that they weren't attempting to make a historically accurate experience. This is historical fiction through and through, a fantasy video game, not a documentary. And two, I believe in my heart of hearts that a lot of these inaccuracies are only there because us non-Japanese dum-dums require a level of shorthand in order to ingest what Japan was like in 1274. No, really, think about it. Consider how many people can immediately recognize buzzwords like katana or haiku. But how many of those same people would recognize other buzzwords like chokuto, genga, tachi, and tanka? My guess? Not nearly as many. So look, I'll make you a deal. As I tear through every element in this game that filled me with a mighty need of research, I'll explain more about what I mean as I come to it. But for now, I want to take you all on the same cultural journey that I took to show you how a non-Japanese team of developers freaking crushed it at recreating not only what Tsushima was like back in the late 1200s, but what Japan was like back in the late 1200s. So to start off, there is little more important to Japan as a society at this time, and to an extent even today, than nature. And when it comes to this game, nature is everything. And I don't just mean the scenery, though let's be real here, this is one of the most beautiful games to have ever come out of the PS4. But nature is all-encompassing to the player, either by manipulating it or being manipulated by it. For example, unlike most sandbox games, there's not a marker in the distance that you go to, but rather the very wind in the air is what guides the player to their destination. And if the player is close to a point of interest, a golden bird will descend down from the sky to lead them to said point. But on the flip side, the player can turn a clear sunny sky into a chaotic thunderstorm, either by their actions in combat or based on the tune that they play on their shakuhachi. Even when it comes to the shrine challenges that has the player scaling and maneuvering rocky mountain paths, all of this by design is nature. You are transversing nature, you are honoring nature, and you are rewarded by nature. Everything in this game, from flora to fauna, is absolutely stunning. But in my opinion, it had to be as beautiful as it is because Japan's individual identity resides in nature, with no greater example than the country's homegrown religion of Shinto. Over 8 million kami reside within the pantheon of Shinto, with many of the more prominent ones showcased in this game as you climb up to honor their shrines. And they make up everything from macro machinations of nature such as the weather, light, darkness, and agriculture, to micro individual elements. Specific mountains, trees, rocks, rivers, lakes, and forests all have their own denizens that represent the natural phenomena that make up their role in nature. They make up everything that exists naturally. Kami are the religious yet logical conclusions that ancient Japan manifested to explain natural phenomena in nature, which is why the visuals of this game, the forest, the sea, the sky, the long fields of grass, they had to be beautiful, because that's how important nature is to Japan. Society at that time, and even to a small extent today, revolves around nature. It's not something easily taken half-hearted, and certainly couldn't have been such in game. But kami represent the beneficial aspects of nature. What about the negative ones? Floods, fires, earthquakes, and disease? Well, all those also fall into supernatural beings. Ayakashi, yokai, bakemono, onryo, There's tons of names for them, but they all factor into nature just as prevalently as kami. And despite this game being grounded in some level of reality, Ghost of Tsushima addresses this aspect of nature as well. There are side quests of missing persons and terrible events, things that superstitious locals blame on these monsters of bad nature. Specifically, there's a multi-tiered quest about Kappa and another one about woods haunted by a samurai turned Onyo spirit. But that's kind of the point. Folks in ancient Japan believed in these creatures of foul nature because they gave a logical personification to these unexplainable, negative natural phenomena of nature. Now, I know I'm going on and on about the broad strokes of Japan's cultural focus on nature and how it's reflected in the game, but more than just randomized nature, ancient Japan revolved even more so around the seasons, and again, as does this game. No, really, there are individual biomes in Ghost that encapsulates each season. From the yellow falling leaves in the golden forests of Ariake, to the warm summer greeneries of Kashine, to the dense snow-covered Sago, each pocket of Ghost of Tsushima houses within it an aspect of the seasons. Not exactly something natural to the subtropic, humid archipelago that rarely sees temperatures drop below freezing. But this importance of seasons is something you can see in even contemporary Japan. For example, all formal business letters today in Japan are always introduced with greetings reflecting the current season. Hanafuda cards, which have been a cornerstone of Japan from old to modern times, are themed around suits of flora that also symbolize the seasons. And finally, the traditions of Hanami in spring, Obon in summer, Momijikari in fall, and Oshogatsu in winter all celebrate the joyous parts of each individual season. But there's one other cornerstone of Japanese culture that really capitalizes on all four seasons. Something that is done nearly ad nauseum in this game: haiku. Now this is the point where the aforementioned historical purists would scream, haikus didn't exist in the 13th century, they were popularized in the 16th century. Yes, my friend, that is true. But while a good number of laymen can relate haiku to Japan easy enough, how about renga, or tanka? Yeah, that's what I thought. Besides, in all technicality, haiku did exist in the late 1200s, just as part of a larger piece. See, back then, a lot of Japanese poetry boiled down into two kinds of systems: renga and tanka. Tanka were poems broken down into 5 lines of 31 on, basically what we know as syllables, following the pattern 5-7-5 for the kami-no-ku, or upper phrase, and 7-7 for the final 2 lines known as the shimo-no-ku, or lower phrase. These were basically poems of love and entertainment, but then there's renga, which takes the format to a whole new level. To make an exceptionally complicated explanation short, renga is basically a tanka that's co-written. Every renga starts off with a hoku, a 5-7-5 on introduction to the poem written by a guest or person of honor. Then from there, a different poet would write a new stanza, usually the waki in the form of a 7-7 count. And then there's the daisan, and on and on and on and on, and you can see why I said this was a complicated explanation. These poems could get anywhere of 100 to 1,000 stanzas long, but in every case, the hoku had to follow a few simple rules. 17 on, 1 kireiji or cutting word used to create a brief pause to reflect on the relations between the parts of the poem, and finally, a kigo, a seasonal word that defined the nature of the poem. Seasonal importance? But then along came a badass named Matsuo Basho in the 1670s, who saw this long, complicated format of poetry and paraphrasingly said, yo, renga is way too elaborate, but how about we take that first part and really make it shine? Which is exactly what he did. Basho took the 5-7-5 hoku introductory stanza and refined it into a new style of poetry that acted as an objective description for the observation of nature that invoked an unstated emotional response. Basically, nature make me feel an emotional thing, but I'm not gonna say what the emotional thing is. That is why each of the 16 different haiku you write in Ghost of Tsushima has you observing the surrounding nature and applying it to each poem, never really stating how Jin felt, but rather inferred his feelings through the observations of the various aspects of nature he came across. While the hoku didn't become its own original thing until the 17th century, and didn't get the name of haiku until the 19th century, the seasonal essence and format of haiku is very much alive and well within poetry in the late 1200s in Japan. And hey, speaking of nature and getting the constant runaround in this game, let's talk about the 49 different fox dens that dot this game map. Yeah, that's over 3 times as many haikus in this game. You're gonna get sidetracked by these things. A lot. Heck, there's even an entire side quest where you take revenge on the slaughtering of Inari foxes and destruction of one of their shrines. But this raises the question as to why. These foxes take you to freaking 49 different shrines of Inari, and Inari already has their own proper shrine. So what gives? Why are there so many? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Inari is just that popular. Within Japan, Inari has 2,970 registered shrines. Already sounds like a lot, right? Well, if you take into account personal shrines, Buddhist temple adjacent shrines, as well as field and road shrines, exactly like the ones we see and use in game, then you're looking at over 32,000 shrines in Japan dedicated to Inari. That's over 1/3 of all Shinto shrines in the country. So what makes Inari so insanely popular? They're the freaking kami of financial success. Who wouldn't want that? Well, specifically, Inari was the kami of agriculture and rice, and if you want to know more about why rice was so important to Japan, just look up the koku. But as Japan shifted from agriculture determining its GDP to modern economics, Inari also transformed into the kami of corporate success. Again, who wouldn't want to honor that kind of kami? From there, let me put the brakes on all this talk of seasons, kami, nature, and the like, because while the notion of nature absolutely was one of the key concepts of Japan that this game took painstaking detail in, the way of the samurai in 1274 was the other. But let's start all that off with something really simple. Yet another runaround of 16 points of interest that has the player transverse Tsushima, the bamboo strike. Players are challenged to cut 3, 5, and then finally 7 lines of bamboo in one clean cut, represented in game as having an elongated stream of button inputs. Basically, symbolic of the concentration that a swordsman would need to have in order to make that one clean cut with all that bamboo. This act in itself is known as Tamishigiri, or test cutting. However, originally it wasn't a test of the swordsman, but rather the test of the sword itself. Although history recalls its origin technically 300 years later than this game during the Edo period. When a sword was made, rather than the swordsmith determining the capacity of their craft, a samurai volunteered to test the blade by cutting wada rice straw, goza tatami mat top layers, fresh green bamboo, as well as corpses or even convicted criminals in some cases. Nowadays though, the process of Tamishigiri is more of a test of skill of the swordsman. As a test of rank or in some cases competition, such as the Iai Bato Do Meiji Jingu Tokyo All Japan contest, men and women test their mettle at making one clean cut in order to slice through multiple targets. Though these days it seems that only tatami mat material is used, not so much bamboo. And the reason for that is that dry bamboo is so dense and hard that cutting it can actually dent the blade. So if you're gonna use bamboo, it's gotta be fresh. Now, I've yet to find any information that disproves samurai in 1274 using any sort of materials for Tamishigiri. It could likely have just been such a normalized practice thing for swordsmiths to do that simply it didn't make much of an impact on recorded history. But as I mentioned before, I believe that this particular type of Tamishigiri in this game is purely shorthand, something that the average layman can attribute to what we understand samurai to be, having seen this 1,000 times before. And hey, speaking of shorthand and things non-Japanese have seen 1,000 times before, let's rap about the armor and weapons in this game, because to some people, these are the biggest offenders to historical inaccuracies. First, the katana, cause see, that right there is the problem. There were no katanas in 1274 Japan. During this time, samurai typically palled around with one of two different kinds of swords. Chokuto, which were straight-bladed swords more akin to what we know ninja-to to be, and the Tachi, strikingly similar to the katana, but a bit longer and a lot more curved. And while the Tachi was completely functional for combat in Japan for nearly 700 years, it was the advent of the Mongol invasion that forced the swordsmiths of Japan to adapt. The broiled leather armor and hard shields of the Mongols caused the Tachi to bend and break. Thus, the smiths developed new cooling methods and utilized a higher carbon steel to forge the katana that we know today, which was strong enough to cut through Mongol armor. But that still doesn't resolve the issue of the apparent timeline paradox of katana use in game. Except that it never really was an issue. Because if you go back and play the game in Japanese, not a soul uses the word katana. They instead use the word tachi.
Tachiが欲しいならついといて。
And considering how similar the two blades are in appearance, I believe that this is, yet again, more shorthand. After all, if you showed the average person these two blades, do you think they would see two drastically different swords? Then there's the question of the Daisho, a term literally meaning big little that represented the atypical combination of a katana and a wakizashi that we typically know samurai to have. Only, the term Daisho doesn't refer exclusively to the katana and wakizashi. It's literally just a concept that meant big sword and little sword. While in 1629 it was mandated by the Bakufu that all samurai wear the Daisho during business activities, the Daisho itself was only really getting popular as a practice in the Muromachi period. Again, some years later after the events of Ghost of Tsushima. And at this time, it was typically the tanto that was paired with a katana. There was no wakizashi. So in a way, the katana-tanto pairing in this game isn't completely historically inaccurate. Plus, there's no official document dating the exact moment that samurai started carrying the daisho around. So, for all we know, maybe there were some samurai toting around two swords at this time. And now we come to the armor, and yeah, even I don't know if there's much to defend with this. Thankfully though, I didn't have to look too far to get the deets on these cultural inaccuracies. Peter over on Twitter actually beat me to that punch, so thanks for letting me cite your findings, man. So anyway, there isn't a single set of samurai armor that even comes close to being time appropriate. The more body contouring armor style of the Samurai Clan armor, for example, was a Sengoku Jidai period style armor, not Kamakura period. The Sakai armor, oddly enough, resembles more of a mass-produced folded armor of Ashigaru peasant soldiers, and the Gosaku armor exclusively has an overcoat called a Jinbaori, an article of clothing for high-ranking samurai only worn in the Sengoku period. But let me ask you again, what style of armor would everyday non-Japanese recognize? The layered Gusoku-style armor of the Sengoku Jidai, or the cubic skirt of the O-Yoroi? Yeah, samurai in the late 1200s wore something way more boxy than what we're used to seeing. Heck, when it was properly stored, it almost looked like a pyramid. This style of armor had tremendous osode shoulder guards and a boxy 4-piece kusazuri. And as you might think, this bulky design wasn't exactly the best for feet-on-ground combat like what the player does in-game. So why design armor that limited foot mobility? Because samurai in 1274 weren't on the ground. They were almost exclusively horse-mounted warriors. And before Japan was dominated by the way of the sword, it was dominated by the way of the bow. Oh yes, in the Kamakura period, it was not Kenjutsu that symbolized the warrior, but rather Kyuba no Michi, the way of horse and bow. Ever since the late 10th century, there was a set of unwritten rules about how samurai were to fight, and all were expected to comply. These tactics were passed down from Japan's greatest war heroes, such as Minamoto no Yorimitsu, Minamoto no Yoshie, and even Prince Shotoku. For me personally, I think this is why the conflict of honor between Jin Sakai and Uncle Shimura is actually historically feasible, despite what we understand Bushido to be to not be relevant for the next 200 years. Jin flat out rejected the very specific way that samurai were expected to fight, which surprisingly the game replicates in great detail. Well, at first anyway. So what are the complicated guidelines of Kyuba no Michi? Well, first the two armies would square each other up, gathering basic information about each other, such as size. Next, the two commanders of the armies would exchange words regarding the fight. Next, to officially start the fight, each side would shoot off a single arrow known as the kaburaya, which signaled the other archers to begin raining down arrows in a period called yawase. Under the cover of arrows, the armies would move to kumiuchi, where infantry would charge on foot while samurai would charge on horseback. Now, should two samurai come face to face, the two would exchange their names and title and begin single combat. First fighting at range with bows and then fighting with polearms and swords when bows became ineffectual. Should a samurai be knocked off their horse, the samurai's retainers would rush in both sides and create a much larger skirmish. Now, how do they do it in game, you may ask? Well, first off, the Tsushima army squares off getting intel on their opponent, so check. Next, Lord Adachi calls the Mongols' best warrior, I assume their leader, to trade introductions, so check and kinda check. After that tradition is spat in the eye, the samurai launch their attack. But you notice something interesting? There's a single flaming arrow launching out followed by the first real volley of arrows. So this is literally the kaburaya followed by the yawase, so double check. Finally, the samurai move into the kumiuchi. But rather than drawing their bows, they draw their swords. Again, I assume because how in the world would the average person have any forward understanding of Kyuba no Michi? People wanted the hacky-slashy samurai experience, which became the shorthand for the game, in its entirety. Look, the point that I'm trying to make with this video is that, yes, it is absolutely true that not everything in this game is accurate to the time period it's supposed to take place in. That much is self-evident. But that which was borrowed from other historical points in Japan were done so with such finite understanding of their history that I still say this is the closest to a perfect samurai game we've ever experienced. I mean, I love series like Way of the Samurai and Neo, but grounded in firm understanding and respect of the history they take after, considering they're both historical fiction, yeah, no, they're grade A buck nutty with 2 scoops of Fruit Loops. Ghost of Tsushima though, they nail it. Yakuza director Toshihiro Nagoishi himself said, "Foreigners who tickle the fancy of the Japanese people more than Japanese people are rather amazing, no?" There's like a notion that Westerners don't understand things about Japan, but that hypothesis itself is mistaken. That's why, in my personal heart of hearts, This game about Japan, developed by a non-Japanese team, may very well be one of, if not the best example of Japan's past in gaming that I've ever seen. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching. And hey, while I'm at it, how about a big fat thank you to all my patrons and supporters who keep these videos coming. Sadly, ad revenue is pretty paltry these days, but because of folks like you, these edutainment videos live on, so thank you so much for that. Like I said, I'll be taking the next week off, but I'll still be streaming over at twitch.tv/Gaijin Goombah every Tuesday, Saturday, and Sunday at 7 p.m. US Central Time. So, come on by and say hi. Otherwise, until next time everyone, this is Gaijin Goombah, signing out.